Somewhere in the summer of 2003, Marvin Heemeyer sealed the windows of his shed from the inside, and nobody in Granby, Colorado thought to ask why. That is where this story really begins. Not on June 4, 2004, when the wall came down and the machine came through. Not in 1998, when the first zoning dispute started. Not even in 1992, when Marvin drove into town and bought 2 acres of land and thought he was starting a new life. It begins in that shed, in that silence, in that particular kind of not being noticed that can settle over a person without anyone intending it. A man disappears from a community by degrees. First, he stops being talked to, then he stops being seen. And somewhere in that long, quiet interval between those two things, he becomes capable of almost anything. I've thought about Marvin Heemeyer for a long time, and the more I sit with his story, the more I think the question most people ask, was he a hero or was he a villain, is the wrong question entirely. The right question is simpler and harder than that. How does a man end up alone enough to do what he did? Granby sits at about 8,000 feet above sea level in a high basin of the Rocky Mountains, roughly 100 miles northwest of Denver. The mountains ring it on every side. In winter, which runs long up there, the snow comes early and stays late, and the roads in and out can close without much warning. It is the kind of place people choose deliberately. Not because it is convenient, but because they want what it offers, which is space and altitude and a certain quality of silence that lower elevations don't provide. The population in 2004 was somewhere around 2,000 depending on the season. In summer, tourists came through on their way to Rocky Mountain National Park. In winter, skiers. The year-round residents were a mix. Long-time ranch families, small business owners, people who had come from elsewhere and stayed because the place got into them. It was not a farming town in the way Skidmore was a farming town. There was no single shared economy, no single way of understanding your place in the world. It was a mountain town, which means it had a different kind of closeness. The closeness of people who endure hard winters together, who know each other at the post office and the hardware store and the one diner that stays open all year. Not the bone-deep generational knowing of a place like Skidmore. Something newer, more provisional. The kind of community that can accommodate an outsider up to a point. Marvin Heemeyer came to Granby in 1992. He was 40 years old. He had served in the Air Force, worked as a welder for years across Colorado, and had built a reputation in the trade that people talked about. The best welder in the valley, more than one person would later say. When he turned up and bought 2 acres at an FDIC auction, foreclosed property cheap, and opened a muffler repair shop, the town received him without ceremony. He was good at his work. People brought him their vehicles, and he fixed them, and the word got around. He loved snowmobiling. He was a bachelor and seemed comfortable with it. He had friends, or what pass for friends in the way small towns produce, the people who liked him, who would wave when they saw his truck, who would sit with him at a bar and talk about the weather and the snowpack. Nobody would have predicted any of this. That is the thing people always say about Marvin Heemeyer, and I believe it is true. He was not a man who gave off warning signs in the ordinary sense. He was not aggressive. He was not the kind of man who started arguments or made threats or made people uncomfortable at the hardware store. He was quiet in the way skilled tradespeople sometimes are self-sufficient, not needing much from others because the work itself was enough. He knew what he could do, and for a few years that knowledge was sufficient. Then the ground shifted beneath him as ground sometimes does. I want to be precise about what happened to Marvin Heemeyer, because imprecision is what has made his story so easy to distort. In 1998, the Docheff family, longtime Granby residents, one of the established names in town, applied to rezone a piece of land adjacent to Marvin's property. They wanted to build a concrete batch plant. The zoning commission considered it. The town trustees voted. The decision came through approved. Construction began. The plant went up right there close against the edge of Marvin's property. And with it came two practical problems that Marvin was never able to fully resolve. The first was access. The construction blocked what he had been using as an informal road to get in and out of his shop. The second was sewage. His property had a rudimentary waste system from before he arrived, a buried concrete mixer essentially, and the town now required him to connect to the municipal sewer line. Doing that meant crossing 8 feet of the Docheff family's new property, and that permission was not forthcoming. Connecting another way would cost somewhere near $80,000. Marvin's entire property had cost $42,000. He fought it the way a person is supposed to fight things. He attended meetings. He filed complaints. He petitioned the EPA, who conducted a noise analysis that went nowhere. He hired a lawyer and pursued legal action against the town. In April 2002, that lawsuit was dismissed. He wrote the word cowards on the memo line of the check when he paid his fines. I want to be fair here. The people who made those zoning decisions were not conspiring against Marvin Heemeyer. Small-town zoning boards are not sinister. The Docheff family had every legal right to build what they built. The system, such as it was, functioned exactly as it was designed to function. It weighed competing interests, applied the rules, and reached decisions. That is what systems do. But here is what systems cannot do. They cannot look at a specific human being, at one man's 12 years of work, at what that work meant to him, at how thoroughly his livelihood and his sense of himself were bound up in those 2 acres, and make their decisions with that particular weight in mind. Systems process requests. They do not see people. And Marvin Heemeyer, who was not a complicated man in most respects, understood this at a level that consumed him. He had appealed every decision he could appeal. He had tried every channel available to him. And when the last appeal was denied and the last letter went unanswered, he found himself standing on his property that he had paid for and worked on for a decade, and looking at a concrete plant on one side and a set of regulations on the other, and there was nowhere left to turn. Not because the system had been cruel, because it had been indifferent. And sometimes indifference cuts deeper than cruelty, because at least cruelty acknowledges you exist. He stopped fighting, and he started building. He mailed the tapes to his brother in South Dakota a few days before the rampage. 7 cassettes, 2 hours and 45 minutes in total. The first recording was made on April 13th, 2004, less than 2 months before June 4th. "Hello, my name is Marvin Heemeyer," he begins. "Today is April 13th, 2004. This tape is about my life since I came up here in 1991. It is an ordinary opening for a document that was meant in his mind to explain everything. He is chatty at first. He talks about his time in Colorado, the muffler shops he had run, the people he had liked, and the people he had not. He sounds in those early minutes like a man telling a long story at a bar. The kind of story that starts reasonable and becomes, over the course of the telling, something the listener is not sure how to receive. As the tapes go on, the reasonableness gives way. He cycles through grievances, some of them real and documented, some of them connections that only existed in his mind. He talks about judges being paid off, about the media covering things up, about how the people of Granby had disliked him from the start because he had bought his property at an auction where a local family had expected to be the winning bidder. The conspiratorial logic tightens with each tape. By the third recording, he is speaking about God with an intensity that is uncomfortable to hear, not the ordinary invocation of faith, but something more absolute, more sealed off. God built me for this job, he says. I think God will bless me to get the machine done to drive it to do the stuff that I have to do. I have listened to descriptions of those tapes many times, and I always come away with the same feeling. Not anger, not pity exactly. Something closer to the feeling you get when you look at a photograph of a place just before something terrible happened. They're a photograph of ordinary life summer light people going about their business unaware of what is coming. The tapes are the sound of a man who had been talking to himself for so long that he had lost track of what a conversation was supposed to feel like. He had stopped expecting to be answered. He had stopped expecting to be heard. The tapes were not really addressed to the world. They were addressed to the void he had been living in for years. What I think about listening to accounts of those recordings is not the rage in them. Rage is comprehensible. What I think about is the loneliness, the 7 hours of a man's voice going into a machine in an empty shed, the detail with which he remembered every slight, every snicker, every meeting where he had raised his hand and been ignored. The way he had preserved all of it turned it over and over in his mind, until it had become something almost sacred to him, his private record of a world that had failed to see him clearly. A good friend told him he should make the tapes, he says, at the start of the first recording. He seemed to think he wouldn't bother. Then he did. He made 7 of them. That detail has stayed with me, that he almost didn't. In July of 2002, a bulldozer arrived in Granby on a flatbed truck. It was a Komatsu D355A, 65 tons bright yellow, built for moving earth. Marvin had bought it at auction in California for $16,000. He parked it outside his former shop with a handmade for sale sign on it. Neighbors saw it. A few people asked about it. He told them he was trying to sell it. Nobody bought it. After a few months, Marvin closed up his muffler shop, the shop he had spent a decade building, the shop that people still talked about as the best welding operation in the valley, and put his tools and equipment up for auction. He sold his land to a waste disposal company for $400,000, roughly 10 times what he had paid for it. He leased back half the building from the new owners. He had some work to finish, he said, and then sometime in late 2002 or early 2003, he began. He moved the bulldozer into the shed. He sealed the windows and the gaps in the walls. People in Granby would walk past and hear the sound of metal on metal, the occasional grind of tools, the muffled noise of work being done. Some people saw the lights on inside late at night. Some people knew vaguely that Marvin was still around, still doing something in there. The shed sat in downtown Granby, 2 blocks from the town hall, a short walk from the newspaper office, visible from the main road. Nobody asked him what he was building. Some people later said they assumed he was restoring the bulldozer, or maybe converting it for some kind of construction work. Some said they had noticed the windows were covered and figured he wanted privacy. Some said honestly that they hadn't thought about it much at all. Marvin had become by that point one of those presences in a small town that you register without really seeing the light in the window. The sound from the shed, the man you wave to, If you happen to pass him on the street, but whose inner life you have long since stopped trying to imagine. Inside that shed, Marvin Heemeyer spent 18 months building a machine that no small arms fire could penetrate, no police vehicle could stop, and no one could get into from the outside. He welded steel plate armor to the bulldozer's body up to 1 inch thick in places. He filled the cavities with concrete. He installed cameras and monitors so he could see where he was going through the armored shell. He cut gun ports and loaded firearms inside the cockpit. He built a ventilation system. He fabricated the top hatch in a separate piece that could only be lowered from inside using a winch after he had already seated himself at the controls. Once the hatch came down, there was no way out. He worked alone. He did not tell anyone what he was doing. And when he sealed himself inside that cockpit on the afternoon of June 4th, 2004 and started the engine, the only person in Granby who was not surprised was Marvin Heemeyer. It was a Friday afternoon, warm for early June at that altitude. The kind of afternoon when the light sits golden and long against the mountains, and the sky is the particular deep blue you only get above 8,000 feet. A quiet day. At approximately 3 o'clock, the wall of Marvin's former muffler shop collapsed outward as 65 tons of armored machine came through it. The first target was the concrete batch plant next door. The machine moved into it slowly, almost deliberately, and the walls came down. Police received the call and arrived within minutes. They fired their weapons at the machine. Nothing happened. The bullet struck the armor and fell away. Officers attempted to call out over loudspeakers. Nothing happened. A deputy tried to drop a flash grenade into the cockpit through one of the gun ports. The gun port was too small. Nothing happened. The machine kept moving. What followed over the next 90 minutes was unlike anything that American law enforcement had encountered in a modern small town. Police from multiple agencies converged on Granby. A SWAT team arrived. They tried to use another piece of heavy machinery to stop the bulldozer. It was pushed aside like a toy. More than 200 rounds were fired in total. The armor absorbed all of it. What strikes me reading accounts of that afternoon is the quality of control that Marvin maintained. He had a list. He had thought about this for a long time. He moved from target to target with the unhurried precision of a man executing a plan he had rehearsed in his mind for years. The concrete plant. The town hall evacuated with minutes to spare, children at story hour rushing out the door as the machine turned the corner. The building where a woman who had sat on the zoning board worked. The office of the local newspaper that had editorialized against him. The home of a former judge's widow. Each address was in his notes. Each one carried a specific grievance documented on his tapes, preserved in his careful memory. Across town, people were running. The reverse 911 system was activated. Businesses emptied. People who had never moved fast in their lives were moving fast. Some people stood on the street and watched, unable to entirely believe what they were seeing. A tank rolling through their town through buildings they had walked past every day of their lives, as unstoppable as a force of nature. And it was in that watching, I think, that something important became clear. This was not a rampage in the chaotic sense of the word. There was a logic to it, a terrible patient logic that had been building for 12 years. Every building on Marvin's list had a reason. Not a good reason. Not a reason that justified any of this. But a reason that connected back to a specific day, a specific meeting, a specific decision that had landed on him and that he had carried alone ever since. After 90 minutes, the machine made its last turn and drove into Gamble's Hardware. The basement gave way beneath it. The bulldozer sank, became wedged, and stopped. Inside the sealed cockpit, one shot was fired. The town went quiet. When investigators finally cut through the armor and opened the machine, they found Marvin Heemeyer dead at the controls, a .357 handgun in the cockpit beside him. They also found the inside of the cab neatly arranged, the cameras, the monitors, the ventilation system, the weapons in their ports. Evidence of 1.5 years of precise patient work. One officer described it as looking like the inside of a submarine. 13 buildings destroyed or damaged. $7 million in damage. Emergency vehicles crushed. A children's library that had been emptied of its story hour by 90 seconds. Propane tanks that Marvin had fired at trying to create an explosion that, had it succeeded, might have killed any number of the police officers jogging alongside him. And not a single other life lost. That last fact is the one the internet seized on. Within days of the rampage, Marvin Heemeyer had become, in certain corners of the online world, something close to a saint. A hero of the common man. A folk legend. Someone had a name for it. Killdozer Day. Every year on June 4th, people who had never been to Granby, who had never met Marvin Heemeyer or Patrick Brower or Casey Farrell or any of the people whose buildings and livelihoods were reduced to rubble that afternoon, celebrated the anniversary of what they called a stand against tyranny. Patrick Brower, who had run the local newspaper for 28 years and who had nearly been killed when Marvin drove through his building, said something about this that I think is worth sitting with. He said, "How many people lose zoning disputes with government in America? Everybody, all the time. That's not an excuse to go out and tear the town to pieces." He is right. Of course he is right. But there is another thing to sit with, and it is this: the people online who celebrate Killdozer Day are not celebrating Marvin Heemeyer specifically. They are celebrating the idea of a man who felt ignored and unheard and invisible, doing something so large and so loud that no one could ignore him anymore. They are celebrating in their way the fantasy of being seen. And that fantasy has a particular resonance in a time when many people feel that the systems meant to serve them are instead indifferent to them, or worse, are actively grinding them down. One form, one fine, one denied appeal at a time. I am not defending what Marvin did. I am trying to understand what it tapped into, and why that understanding matters. Because the next version of this story, whoever the next person is who seals himself into a shed and stops being reachable, the only way to see him coming is to understand what made Marvin disappear in the first place. Casey Farrell's hardware store was where the machine stopped. The building is rebuilt now. He reopened eventually, though it took more than 7 years, and he never fully recovered what he had built. He told a reporter once that the event changed the way he looked at people, at things. Not that he didn't feel safe, just that something had shifted in how he understood the world he lived in. I think about that shift a lot. The particular thing that a day like June 4th, 2004 does to a community is different from what other kinds of violence do. It wasn't a stranger who passed through and left destruction behind. It was a man they knew, a man they had trusted with their vehicles, whose name was in the phone book, whose light they had seen burning in the shed on winter nights and had not thought much about. The damage to the buildings could be repaired. The damage to the idea that you know your neighbors that is harder to rebuild. And then to have that man transformed by strangers on the internet into a hero. To have people arrive in Granby looking for the site of the famous rampage, the way other people visit battlefields with a kind of reverence that has nothing to do with what was actually lost that afternoon. That is its own particular injury. Brower wrote a book. He spent years trying to correct the record to put the real facts in front of people who had only seen the legend. He said he believed that the way people venerated Marvin had been repeated in other rampages and tragedies across America in the years since. That the romanticization of a man's violence, the lifting of a specific act of destruction into a symbol of righteous resistance, was something that cost real people in real places over and over again. I believe he is right about that too. The shed is gone now. The property was sold and cleared. There is nothing at the address where Marvin Heemeyer spent 18 months alone with a machine and a plan and a set of tapes that he almost didn't make. Granby has been rebuilt. New buildings where the old ones came down. The town hall has a new facade. Gamble's Hardware is an appliance and mattress store now. The killdozer was cut into pieces, and its parts were scattered across multiple scrap yards, a deliberate decision made by people who understood the danger of relics, who did not want a shrine. The machine that could not be stopped by 200 rounds of ammunition was undone in the end by angle grinders and a decision that some things should not be preserved. What I keep coming back to after everything is not the machine. It is the tapes. 7 hours of a man's voice recorded alone in a shed addressed to a brother in South Dakota. To investigators who would eventually listen to a world Marvin had stopped believing would hear him. He starts each recording with his name as if to establish that he exists. Hello, my name is Marvin Heemeyer. As if there was a real chance by that point that someone might have forgotten. He was a good welder, the best in the valley, people said. He loved snowmobiling. He came to Granby looking for a life that fit him, and for a few years it did, and then the ground moved, and the walls closed in, and he dealt with it the way the system said to deal with it, and the system didn't save him, and eventually he ran out of things to try. And then he stopped trying, and he started building, and nobody asked him what he was building, and that silence, that ordinary, thoughtless, not unkind silence of neighbors who had stopped paying attention. That silence was the last thing that needed to be in place before everything else became possible. I don't know what a town owes a man like Marvin Heemeyer. I don't know what he was owed that wasn't given, or what he took that he had no right to take. Those questions don't resolve cleanly, and I distrust anyone who tells you they do. What I know is that there was a point, probably more than one, where the distance between Marvin and the people around him could have been closed. A conversation, a compromise. A moment where someone looked at the light burning in the shed on a winter night and thought to knock on the door. I don't know if it would have changed anything. I think about it anyway. There is a question that Granby, Colorado left behind, and it is not the question of whether Marvin was right or wrong. It is quieter than that, and in some ways more difficult. What does it take for a man to disappear from the people around him while standing in plain sight? And what does it cost a community to answer that question only after the wall comes down?